Greetings and welcome to this podcast. And will the door please open? Gentleman and lady coming in there. This awkward part will be edited out of the podcast. Do you wish to make your way to your seat instead of standing awkwardly there? Perhaps next time you will think to return earlier to the arena. So, of course, many delays to the podcast. But luckily you've missed nothing, as the first question is yet to be asked. And that question tonight is going to come from you, the audience. So, who would like to ask the first question? Remember, the question could be anything. A question about me, a question about life, a question about the workings of your own soul that you wish me to help with, a problem you wish me to solve, or perhaps a task you want me to help you with. Perhaps it's cutting along the dotted lines very straight and neat. Perhaps it's discussing the correct hem length for your trouser. Or perhaps it's advice on how to best fashion a goose from butter in the butter sculpture. Whatever your question or task is, I'm here to answer. What is the first question? Oh, we have a question here from Mr. Tiffin. Connoisseur Mr. Tiffin, what is your question?
You know how recently, in the last few years, toilets, when you flush them now, there's two separate things. It always used to be just push the thing at the side of the toilet, now they have a double button.
A flusher! A double flusher! Does that answer your question?
No.
Your questions are complicated. What is your deeper question?
Nowadays, when you go to the toilet, there's two options on the flush button.
That's right! We've established that. What is your question? You have now set up the question to a stage where everyone understands what the question is. Now, we wait rapidly to hear what the question is. Some of us may not have been primed or any for the question. We may not have known that toilets sometimes have a double flush button. We may have been in some confusion as to what a toilet was and what the flush accomplishes. But now we know. And now we desperately seek that first question that will kick off the podcast and move us all along in our lives beyond this part, ever closer to inevitable death. We have a choice in our lives. We all have choices we must make daily and hourly. We can either listen to you constantly discussing with us how there are two buttons that we already know, or we can hear your question and get on with the rest of our lives. Perhaps fall in love, perhaps go into cake making, perhaps take up the theatre organ and realise that we've taken up too late in life. Probably one of those things, if you really want to get to the top, you have to start much younger. But nevertheless, it's not about being the greatest theatre organist, it's about enjoyment. It's about plunging your hands onto the keys of that Wurlitzer and letting go the normally reserved facade, slipping away as you play the old show tunes followed by returning home to your love partner for an evening of unrestrained sexual making. Your love partner says, "You've never been like this before. What's changed?" You say, "What's changed?" What's changed is that the organ has changed my life. It's allowed me to release the inner me. As I play It Had to Be You in a samba combo version on the Wurlitzer, I can feel myself releasing psychologically and emotionally. Sometimes, as the theatre organ rises from the low ground up, as it rises, one of those rising organs, I also rise with it. Sometimes I don't even get round to the recital. It's just being near the organ. Sometimes I just get to the organ loft and I leave immediately for sex. Sometimes I don't even make it home to my wife. Sometimes the urge is so great that on the way home I quickly drop into a knocking shop. In fact, conveniently located next to the theatre where the theatre organ is sited. So, as I say, hearing your question will allow us to move on from to take up the organ, and the organ will be in many ways, it's a blessing, yes, a release, a psychological, emotional release, but it brings with it sadness, the loss of your wife. She leaves you following the allegations of the prostitutes on the outskirts of the theatre. Of course, it doesn't affect the lives of the prostitutes. For them, it's just another day of work. They don't care whether the next client is a distressed businessman from Basingstoke. A young stallion who's got more to give than his wife can accept. Or a repressed bachelor who has finally found release from the organ. The prostitute is always the winner. As she lies on her bed that has no bedding, and she hears the sounds of honeysuckle rose on the Hammond, she knows it is not long before another client will be knocking at her door. For her, your question is not important. She will always lie there, performing the sustenance.
He's just told me he's absolutely shitting himself. That's what he just whispered.
He's a bit nervous about asking the question.
Very nervous now. Really nervous.
Why are you nervous? Do you feel the question has been built up? To a level that it can only be a disappointment. To the level where you might say to your wife, "I've been reading a book and I've learned a new sex act today." But you build it up to the level that when you finally get home, the wine is consumed, and you're ready to perform the new sex act you just learned. It's a devastating disaster. A young stallion who has so much more to learn about technique. A young stallion who has to learn there's more to life than the unrestrained rock. Finesse, beauty, sleight of hand. These are the missing ingredients for you, my son. What is your question?
Has it ever been made entirely clear what those two buttons are for? Is it as simple as wee and poo? And if it is, why has no one ever told me?
It's a good question, Paul. Don't tell me.
We will be touching on your question later in the story. But suffice to say that one of the buttons is for those who favour hygiene. The other for those who favour the environment. What other questions do I have? Another question? It has been quite a long podcast, you might just leave it there. It's been quite long just for the one question, hasn't it? I can see Aaron is not satisfied. Here's the master of the podcast. What other question do we have? A question from you. The husband of the lady that I've forgotten the name of. Who's a regular. What is the name of what's the question of your question? What's the first of all, before you ask your question, what's the name of your question? Darren. Darren is the name of the question. And tell us about Darren. What is Darren?
Darren is a question.
Yeah, what is the question?
The question is, if my marriage isn't based on friendship, how long would you give it?
This question relates to something that was asked earlier about this gentleman's marriage that is based not on friendship, but instead on money, social standing, a desire to be seen, to see and be seen in the right cocktail parties. I would give your marriage a lifetime.
Hey.
A lifetime of love. A life sentence of despair. A half century of hopelessness. Decades of joyless yet stable misery. But you may think my words are unnecessarily bleak. But you have achieved much. Whilst a young stallion oscillates from one ill-advised boudoir to another. My point is, and I will frame the answer, not to you, sir, but to your beautiful wife. You have made a good choice with this man. Yes, you could have chosen a young stallion. Yes, with your husband. And how long have you been married? 2 years. 3 years. 3 years, it seems like 3 years. Yes, after such a short time, the love making has already become shatteringly dull. Yes, a row about who left the frying pan out is your only socialising for the week. Yes, your mother-in-law may be a racist.
She reads the Daily Mail.
She reads the Daily Mail. But you have created the perfect environment in order to raise children. We all know the perfect environment for children as laid out by the government. We know that a lot of children these days are raised in less than perfect conditions. Some with a pair of homosexual father, daddy and father. 2 men who love each other and also love their child. A child that was conceived with an ill-advised lesbian. A friend with whom relations have now turned sour. Is this the perfect environment to raise a child? No. Or some are raised under the spectre of the single mother. A woman who devotes her whole life to her child. But ultimately, that's not enough. Because the single mother, despite her love for her child, is always ever so slightly miserable. Is that the perfect environment to raise a child under the spectre of a miserable, slightly bitter woman? Going on about men who betrayed her. What about raising a child in a less conventional setting? Perhaps out of the wedlocks. A young stallion. Before meeting the love of his life, has created a baby with a woman from Shrewsbury. It's an episode of his youth that he regrets. But it's one of those things, and he's a man, and he's going to visit his child often. And although he and his ex-girlfriend are no longer an item, they are still the best of friends. They've learned to get on with each other for the sake of the child. In fact, it's made them closer. seeing her former boyfriend with her new love has only increased the joy in her life as she now raises her child, supports her financially, and at weekends, by the stars. Sometimes calling the stars to ask whether he can pick a child up on Thursday from ballet. The stars, although he would prefer to be down a pub, rise into the challenge. Sometimes the stars already down the pub and the new girlfriend answering the phone. A slightly awkward yet convivial conversation between the two women. One who has captured the heart of the stars. The other who has captured quite a lot of the money of the stars. Some of which is used for day-to-day bills, others which is used as a sort of trust fund for a child of 18th birthday. Indeed, things are so convivial that one time they decided to all go on holiday camping. What could be better for the child than to be with his mother, his father, and of course father's new girlfriend? Yes, there are those who sit there dismissively. But we must remember these unconventional arrangements are an arrangement filled with love. That is only the right thing for the child. And of course, over a few glasses of wine, the group bond. As the child lies in the sleepy part the stud's girlfriend pops over to gaze at a horse in a nearby field. Thoroughbred horse. And the stud remembers as he and his former girlfriend chat about old times. He remembers what he loved about her, which was, of course, lovely breasts and a massive vagina. Before long, one thing's leading to another. But who's this returning from the horse? Look, it's the new girlfriend, shocked to see what's going on, ripping the relationship apart. That's the three adults tearing each other's faces, arguing and shouting as the child screams, "Oh, mommy! Oh, daddy! Oh, daddy's new girlfriend! Please, look after me, I'm just a little child!" But that's all forgotten about now. We've found out the stud is showing its true colours. When it comes to the choice between the son and son and a right old argument, ding dong with the two women, the stud has the argument, ignoring his son. Is that the right environment? No. Your situation, your marriage, which was set up, dull, unremarkable, some would say catastrophic, is the perfect environment to have a child, and I wish you well with your marriage. Do we have time for a final question? We have time for a final question. Quick question, final question. And we've got a question from this lovely lady here. And what is your name, madam?
Nikki, darling.
Nicky Darling. Miss Darling, what is your question?
Is there a scale by which you could measure how special Aaron is to you? And if so, where would you put him on it?
Is there a scale in which I measure the specialness of Aaron? To me. You must remember the question is about his specialness to me, not to his family and so on, who must stand by him come what may. This is their job in the low times to pick up the pieces. My job as his employer and as his inspiration is to drive him, to break him down and rebuild him. So, in answer to the question, what was it on a scale? Was it a scale of 1 to 10, you said?
No, you have to
Make the scale. I have to make my own scale.
When does an Aaron become an Aaron?
When does an Aaron become an Aaron? Well, I think it's to do with the spelling. It's got 3 A's in it's Aaron. And if it's got 2 A's and 2 R's in, then it's Aaron, possibly the island. I mean, that is actually, to be honest, you touched on an important point now. Because that is one of the reasons why I misguidedly and mistakenly hired Aaron. Because I believed I was booking a 2-week holiday. In the Scottish Isles. But instead, what I received was a contract of employment that I had signed whilst drugged and an idiot. So, going back to your question, Miss Darling, on the scale, going from low to lowest of the low. Aaron would be far, far down. In fact, so far down, he's disappeared. A true victim of the double flush. This ties us in neatly to our first question from Mr. Tiffin. Because if there were a way to expel Aaron from my life, if I were given a choice of the big flush button and the little flush, the little flush button being a legal loophole in the contract of employment, meaning I could be saved from my legal responsibilities. The large flush button being, in this metaphorical sense, the scimitar of death. Have I gone too far with this part? I would use the scimitar of death to slash the contract in two. Suddenly, when you bandy about a scimitar or other oriental weapon in an office environment, you often find that the complex legal arguments melt away. And very soon, even though someone has a perfect legal right to work for you, you find that they voluntarily decide to terminate the employment. So, in answer to your question, Miss Darling, on the scale, I would be dressed as a Japanese warrior. Not at all in a racist way, just totally authentic. To the level where people could say, well, I don't think it's right. You couldn't put your point, you couldn't say that's racist. It's just someone totally dressed as a Japanese warrior with sword. Because I think we all know that Japan is one of the oldest and greatest cultures on earth, isn't it? Long before we here in the West thought we were sophisticated, they had the most sophisticated of cultures with complex social interactions, with refined customs. But there is one danger of Japan, and that is Japanese warrior come at you with sword. So, in answer to your question, Miss Darling, in order to terminate Aaron's employment, I shall place him through a Japanese-themed nightmare. It starts with him arriving on a Tuesday morning at work. He notices something is slightly awry as he opens the door and sees a white sheet with a red circle on. It seems nothing remarkable. Later, of course, he realises the significance of the national flag. As he goes towards his desk in order to go about his tiresome day of faxing trivial emails that no one reads, meaningless administration of the most petty kind, and low-status phone calls, he notices upon his desk a bowl of miso soup, steaming. It is at this stage that he realises his fate is sealed. Turning around, he hears the sound of the Japanese bullets train. But it is not a Japanese bullet train, but in fact me, dressed in a pantomime train fashion. A bit like a pantomime cow for a train. I am the back legs of the train. My accomplice, a young stud, playing the role of the front of the train. Suddenly, I burst from the back of the train, dressed as Japanese warrior with sword. A ninja. Is it ninja? I thought ninja's that green thing, isn't it? Isn't ninja a green thing? That turtle thing. It's nothing to do with Japan. You're being positively racist. I'm not being racist, I'm just doing a reenaction. With the what?
You said it with the mic.
With the mic.
So you're racist. I can say it quietly.
You can say it quietly and you're not racist. What about the Japanese being green?
In New England, miles more racist. Chinatown's there.
Chinatown's there, that's even more racist. right. The Japanese themed nightmare is difficult to pull off. So I do have to resort to adding a few other influences, like Chinese. In fact, to be honest, to answer your question, Miss Darling, it's not really a Japanese themed nightmare. It's more of a Far East thing. It's ancient, it's loosely based around China. China sort of Japanese fusion themed. Suddenly a bamboo stick comes to the window. And suddenly suddenly the triad makes a visit. Suddenly, Aaron takes his final sip of soup. Soup that is hot and sour, but slightly hotter and slightly sourer than even expected. That's the Chinese surprise. Finally, in the final moments of the nightmare, a little bit of North Korea is thrown in. As he sees his former employer standing some distance away on a platform, whilst several thousand people worship me. Unquestioningly. Because they have to. Or they die. Aaron himself realises he has no choice and follows their lead, entering the crowd and, like them, kneeling upon the ground, prostrate and also prostate. His prostate gland against the ground as he kneels with the others, worshipping and weeping before the great leader, being me. Finally, he realises that, like them, he has started to believe the evil propaganda of the leader. His brain has been washed. His soul, like the man in 1984, has been lost. That is the fate not only of Aaron, but of many of the North Korean people. Am I being racist? No. I'm simply pointing out that the North Korean regime is a pile of absolute toss. And that is the answer to your question, Ms. Darling. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the podcast.